This podcast is for information purposes only and is not and should not be construed as professional advice or an offer or commitment by any Rabobank Group member to enter into a transaction. The views expressed by the presenter and or guests are their own and do not necessarily represent the views of Rabobank. Please see the podcast description for our full disclaimer. You'd be hard-pressed to read a farming magazine, listen to a rural radio show, or attend an agricultural conference where there wasn't some discussion relating to reducing on-farm greenhouse gas emissions. But are these discussions actually occurring amongst those that will be required to actually do the heavy lifting, i.e. the farmers? And if not, why not? I'm your host, Blake Holgate, and today I'm joined by someone who has just published some research looking into this very question. KPMG Director of Private Enterprise, Nick Swallow. Nick, welcome to Growing Our Future podcast.
Thanks very much, Blake, for having me on the show. It's a real privilege to be here and looking forward to the discussion.
Yeah, likewise. Before we crack into the discussion, why don't you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself, your career and your current role?
Yeah, thanks, Blake. So I'm originally from Christchurch, as you mentioned. I'm living in Auckland now. My father is from Banks Peninsula and my mother from Ashburton, Tynwald to be precise. And so many of my family have farmed in those regions, but my parents aren't farmers. And actually my father was the first person in his school to pass School C on the first go. And then he managed to actually go through and get a PhD from Canterbury University in chemistry. My mother was a dental nurse, raised the kids. So very traditional kind of 80s Kiwi upbringing. And I ended up studying at Canterbury too, doing genetics and biochemistry. Did my OE, came back to New Zealand and had various roles. And I ended up with New Zealand Trade and Enterprise and found myself back in 2015 moving over to Brazil to be the regional director for New Zealand Trade in Latin America. And I was based in Sao Paulo, big city of sort of about 30 million people, there with my wife, 5-year-old daughter and 7-year-old son at the time. So that was a hell of a culture shock and a language shock at the same time. But, you know, across the region from a New Zealand perspective, really where we were aiming, the thrust of the work that we were doing was supporting New Zealand companies in the food and beverage and the agricultural technology space, which were the key exports into there because Latin America is a farming continent to an extent as well. So I spent a lot of time in supermarkets. I spent a lot of time on farms, and I went to a lot of rural shows across the continent. And it was just really wonderful. My first sort of real exposure to New Zealand technology and our farming systems and how that was viewed in the high regard that it was viewed within. And I also had the privilege of visiting Simon Wallace's farm there in Bahia, so a Kiwi who's farming in Brazil. Impressive outfit, 3,500 cows, 5,500 hectares with these massive rotary irrigators. It was a real eye-opener for me. And they just built their own milk processing plant there because the road in and out was so crappy to get in. It was so crappy, actually. I was there with Mike Peterson, who was New Zealand's agricultural trade envoy at the time. We had to dig the wheels of the truck out of the road to get through. But what was really fascinating about that role was seeing the impact of New Zealand agriculture on the world stage and as I said, how we were viewed. From there, in 2018, I was shipped off to the UK, where I was New Zealand's Trade Commissioner to the UK and Ireland, based in New Zealand House at the High Commission there. And that was really because in 2016, the referendum for Brexit had come about. And look, it was a political storm and a trade drama all in one. And really, you know, the trade very rarely makes the front page of the newspaper. And the UK was the place to be at that time from a trade perspective with Brexit because it was on the front page of the newspaper most days. And my role in there was really to work with the team to bring about an understanding of what's the impact on New Zealand business to the UK and how do we respond to that. And that's because typically, you know, the path to the UK back then, while it was in the EU, was to send your goods to the UK and then distribute them all throughout Europe. So that trade route changed overnight on the 31st of January 2020. Then we had the COVID lockdowns and then flowing through into the free trade agreement. So it was never a dull moment. But with that role again, I was out talking to farmers in the UK and also into industry bodies, into the co-ops there, into the producers. Then they have a really keen interest on where New Zealand was heading. But what I was noticing, Blake, and kind of coming into the space we're in now, was I was seeing sustainability come through as a really strong feature of the market. That was coming through from retailers, and I'm sure everyone's heard of the Tesco letter and those types of things around emissions, but seeing it coming through from the regulators and the consumers, and really a sense that New Zealand businesses needed to respond to that change, but didn't have all the information. So we were working on that space, and at the time I felt my motivation and passion is around, and I can talk a little bit more about this later, is around the prosperity of New Zealand and the agricultural, the food and fibre backbone as being a big part of that. So I went and did a master's at Cambridge, which is where the research I talked to you about today came from. And I want to focus that on New Zealand. I've been back in New Zealand for a couple of years now. And as I said, as you mentioned at the start, I'm working at KPMG in Auckland. But I should just point out that today's discussion is about my research with Cambridge, and it's not to do with my role at KPMG. But I am focused on sustainability consulting there.
Okay, well, let's talk about that research, and thanks for the intro. Nick, that's a really interesting background, and I think gives some good context to the discussion we're going to have. Now, you recently published your research, your study in the Journal for Rural Studies, and who knew there was a Journal for Rural Studies, but there is, and I've now read at least one article in it. It was called Examining Farmers' Motivations to Engage in Low-Carbon Agricultural Practices, a Study of New Zealand Farmers. I suppose the first question is, what was your motivation? And you've touched on a little bit, but do you want to expand, why did you pick that topic?
Yeah, look, as I mentioned before, what I was seeing is those changes in the regulations and those types of things. And really, the EU, to some extent, is setting the agenda globally on some of these things just through what's called the Brussels effect. So, they are implementing quite a lot of regulation around sustainability. So, again, not well understood necessarily by all New Zealand companies. And as I mentioned, the driver for me, food and fibre is the backbone of our economy. It's contributed a lot to our nation, and it will continue to do so. But I saw through a lot of that regulation, a lot of the work that was changing, that there's pressure coming on the sector. And with the role that I had in the UK, there were a lot of politicians coming through New Zealand House there, a lot of industry leaders. I was starting to read a lot in the media around agricultural emissions. And of course, at this time, we're talking about when He Waka Reka was looking at pricing agricultural emissions. And, through the media, you hear a lot about probably more the squeaky wheels necessarily than where the average or the quiet, hard grafting Kiwi farmer's at. And I started to kind of think about, well, with all the change in the world, from what the politicians, industry leaders are wanting, actually the change doesn't happen unless the farmers want to change. And so I asked those people, where did they think that the farmers were at? And I didn't get any convincing answers, Blake. And so nothing was coming back to me. And I felt that, understanding the motivations of farmers is imperative to lining up that expectation between what the markets are demanding, and the change that might be required. And so that really inspired me to think, how do I get into and understand what those topics are, and by talking to farmers. And obviously the focus for the research that I did, as you mentioned from the title, is around dairy farming, but this is a politically interesting topic too, and it is for New Zealand. So I wanted to do something that was impactful, and understanding that, because farming or agriculture and dairy farming does make up a significant contribution to New Zealand's greenhouse gas emissions profile, and as you'll be aware, there's a lot of emphasis on reducing that. Through the Paris Agreement, globally, countries have signed up to being net zero by 2050. So reducing their carbon emissions over time. So it sort of started to build up to being, this is an important part of that equation. But it has been quite political, and it's hard to believe. I can remember when Shane Ardern drove his tractor Myrtle up the steps of Parliament in 2003, and that was protesting against the Kyoto Protocol, which at the time there was introducing a levy of $650 per, I think it was $650 per annum per farmer, and that the government backed down, and so we've seen a lot of rhetoric and desire to change it, but it's shifted over time. And look, I think just to take a step back from that, it's also a really necessary topic globally, and it is a fine balance, because what we're looking at is a growing global population, a need to reduce emissions, to reduce the worst impacts of climate change, and food production contributes 18% of global greenhouse gas emissions, but also it's clearly important to feed everybody, and it underpins our health, our social order, and all those types of things. And then you've got the added mix of climate change actually impacts, changing weather patterns impact onto food production as well. So there is a lot going on, and part of the motivation for me was around the time in New Zealand House I was working with someone called Jeff Grant, who was the red meat sector rep in London, and he handed me a book by Neil Wallace called When the Farm Gates Open, and it's a book about the shock of the 1984 reforms, and how the primary industry really bore the brunt of New Zealand's reforms in that at that time. And it's a fascinating book. So it's a book of two halves, really. It talks about the history of the reforms in the first half, which is fascinating. But then the second half, each chapter takes an individual farmer's story, and it makes it really personal. And it's quite a powerful read, that part of it. And look, those reforms come about ironically from the work that I was doing, the UK joining the EU in 1973, and that impacting on New Zealand's trade. And look, the shock of those reforms were felt overnight. It helped ready us to be market-facing agricultural producers. But my sense from reading the book was that the impact of that was so sharp that there's sort of a decade or two of pain to get through, and between 1973 and 1984 could have more been done to reduce that pain, and a sense that I don't think we're quite on the same kind of trajectory when it comes to emissions, but how do you move the conversation along so that it doesn't become a shock and you don't have some of that pain? So that was kind of a big motivation for me. I was looking at the parallels between those two times.
Yeah, and I fully agree. I think there's some good analogies or hopefully learnings we can take from that. I have actually read that book. It is a very interesting read. And coincidentally, Neil was the previous guest we had on this podcast directly before you. And he's just been traveling around various markets for 6 weeks to understand what the motivation is coming from the market. And as you've illustrated, the markets seem highly motivated to reduce emissions, but ultimately they're motivated for someone else to do something,
yes,
i.e. reducing their emissions. So I suppose the question is, Nick, with your findings, were those people, i.e. the New Zealand farmers, and in this case dairy farmers, are they motivated to reduce their emissions on farm? So
that's really the crux of it, Blake. And so what I did do, I interviewed 15 farmers. So like I mentioned before, this is qualitative, so it's really about understanding the topics. It's not about quantifying how important each of them are. There is in the research I go, that could be for another researcher to pick up. But so I interviewed those farmers across Southland, Canterbury, Taranaki and Waikato. And just for context for this discussion, they were farmer owners, and herd sizes of about 200 to 1,300 cows. So these aren't commercial farming operations. I visited some of them for the interviews, and then the interviews went up to just before the cyclone hit in February 2023. It was actually the night before was the last interview I did. And look, the research beforehand, so I did a lot of kind of trying to understand behavioural change in farmers. And what it told me is that in general, resistance to change amongst farmers is generally quite high. But their tolerance to risk is quite stable. And that's the kind of degree to which they accept volatility and investment. Now, what that means in kind of real world terms is farmers don't make decisions lightly, but when they do take a decision, they stick to it, and they see it through. And so they have what I would kind of term as a more conservative long-term view. And that makes sense, right? Because what you're dealing with is a complex system, and generally you're dealing with an intergenerational view of the farm. So those two things kind of match up. So, and what I looked at, Blake, was really a model of behavioural change, and it's one that is quite tried and tested in this space. And the first part I looked at was, farmers' beliefs in this area. So why are they farming? Because it's a big part of the motivation. How do they view emissions and how do they view climate change? And the big thing that came through almost universally for farmers was they want to be good stewards of the land and they're there for future generations. So they really do see this long-term view. And what that means for them today is generally, can I pass on a financially viable farm, right? These are businesses, they're there to make money, so that kind of adds up, makes sense. The general acceptance that climate change is happening, and that's often because farmers can walk outside and see it, right? And they're seeing more erratic rainfall patterns, longer dry spells. And one farmer I spoke to in Canterbury, who was a bit higher up, had been farming there for about 40 years. He was used to going out in the early days and breaking ice on the water troughs in winter every day. And he was just finding that it reduced to once a week type thing. So quite visible sorts of things. There's a general acceptance from the farmers that this is a result of human activity. But a few felt that also we're experiencing just climatic shifts in general, and perhaps human activity is only one factor that's coming through in that. But, the really interesting thing was that they didn't, almost a lot of the farmers didn't believe that altering farming practices globally would significantly reduce emissions. And that's, that, as I mentioned before, farmers want to do the right thing. They want to improve their land. But that was the kind of sense of where they're up to in that space. And on the other side, the other thing I looked at was it's what's called normative beliefs. But what that really is kind of, how am I influenced by others? And really interestingly, farmers in the research that I did beforehand, they're extremely influenced by what other farmers are doing, right? Looking over the fence and seeing what other farmers are doing. So and we're all influenced by other people. I think we probably like to think that we make great rational decisions based with all the information in front of us and fully formed. But really, we do also rely on what friends, families, colleagues do. So in that sense, farmers are no different. But they're quite torn in the interviews I had between what society expects from them when it comes to sustainability and a desire to be a good, productive farmer to the farming community. And so those things weren't always aligned. And so some farmers consequently kind of switched off to society's view around their environmental expectations. Switched off might be going a little bit far, but just sort of didn't treat it too seriously because they feel it's becoming unrealistic, increasingly unrealistic over time. And so really what happened is the motivation is coming closer to home. So they're interested in what other farmers are talking about, as I mentioned, and within their local communities because they felt that was better understood, which is, I think quite natural in that sense. What I was really encouraging for me out of it is a lot of farmers mentioned that was they didn't want to set up a kind of us versus them approach, a town versus farm. And many farmers are really conscious that over time that wouldn't be very helpful. But the interesting thing was around greenhouse gas emissions, really low levels of discussions between farmers. Many farmers said they didn't know any other farmers that were actively pursuing practices to reduce emissions, or they might have known one person who was doing something over there, but it wasn't widespread. And yet the interesting thing was, Blake, that a lot of the farmers that I interviewed had reduced their herd numbers in recent times, and that was mostly due to cost pressures, wanting to reduce inputs into their farm. But they'd managed to maintain production levels, and that's actually what they would have done in that case, is reduce the intensity of their emissions on a sort of per litre of milk basis. And then finally, the third part. So the first part was what do they believe in this space? Second part is how do they feel about what people around them are talking about? Is do they feel they've got the ability to make the change? And there's a sense there that there wasn't enough to implement, and there are more pressing concerns at the moment. And so one farmer just summed that up in a very succinct way, saying, look, this is the 8th thing on the list for me at the moment, and then rattled off kind of where the 7 others sat. A feeling that the economics aren't quite there yet, and a skepticism that lower carbon items may not command a price premium in international markets. And that was the lens it was kind of looked through. And one of the more fascinating from a kind of academic perspective, because it hasn't been sort of highlighted before, was that there was a sense of a reduced intention to act now because of the promise of future technology to solve this problem. So, the kind of sense of why spend $1 today when this problem will probably be solved for me in 3 to 5 years' time with a vaccine, a bolus, genetics, or what have you. And so a reliance on that technology, but there's a big assumption behind that'll come along and do that. When in reality, there are things that many farmers could be doing now to put themselves in a better position and using that future technology to augment the reductions over time. So some farmers were acting now, which is great, but what they understood was that that the way that they were looking at this, they were really future-proofing their farm, and the lens that they were looking at is, yes, they're looking at the intergenerational view, but it was about building resilience in terms of understanding that market demand, and in the few instances that was happening, it was driven by children returning to the farm and getting involved and going, look, we need to be thinking about this thing, and here's some areas, and the parents going, right, that's where we'll head. But in general, a lot of other farmers view emissions reductions as a possible expense without a current payoff.
Yeah, I mean, I like the way you put it. It's 8th on the list, so it's obviously not a priority. But maybe we'll delve into that a wee bit more, because I think you've done a really good job of outlining what doesn't motivate farmers. But if you kind of flip it on its head, what does motivate farmers? What are we don't need to go run through what the top 7 things on the list would be, but what would motivate them to take action on the 7 things before the 8th thing being reducing emissions?
Yeah. So it's really good. I think that that it's my sense here is this isn't just an issue for farmers to deal with. This is actually an industry issue. I think there's a lot to unpack through all of the players throughout the value chain of how this works. And I think that what I'm kind of saw in there is that incentive to act wasn't built as strongly. And I think there's a role for industry to do that, which to your credit, Blake, and to Rabobank, things like this podcast, I think, do a lot of supporting that type of thing. But from the farmer's perspective, a sense of, improved skills and knowledge, that and not wanting that necessarily, and they did want that in farmers speak, and a sense of limited options to implement without reducing food production. So help me get there without doing those things. I think there's a role to play in terms of building that motivation around how do you encourage conversations between farmers on this. And because, as I mentioned before, it wasn't a topic of conversation that many farmers have. They're not kind of sitting there going, what are you doing for the school holidays? And by the way, how are your emissions reductions going? It's just, that's not the case. But where it was happening, interestingly, were things in like catchment groups, where they tended to have more of these conversations. And in fact, I've stayed in touch with some of the farmers throughout this interview since then. I think what's really good is when you get people like Vangelis Vitalis, the Ministry for Foreign Affairs and Trade Deputy Secretary for Economic and Trade, coming through and actually like talking to some of these catchment groups about what's going on in the market. I think that's really important to build that up. I think there's a role around incentivisation, and it doesn't necessarily need to be government incentivisation, but as I said, through those different industry bodies, through co-ops, through regional and local councils. I think there's a need to kind of look at how we frame the long-term viability of farming as being financial, yes, but what is the productivity, efficiency and sustainability approach to that? And how does that all link towards greenhouse gas emissions performance? And the other thing is, I think, like from talking to the farmers, is that quite often we talk about these topics as being separate. And the sense that I got from the farmers I spoke to is that emissions reductions isn't really necessarily a standalone item. Which makes sense because farms are a complicated system. Every farm is slightly different. And so the farmers, when I visited their farms, were keen to kind of point those things out to me, what was different about their farm. And so I think when we're talking about these things, it really should be around production, efficiencies, animal health, soil health, all of those types of things, and emissions as a part of that whole structure. And I think that as soon as you start to pull things out separately, it doesn't help that conversation. And, there's a really interesting study actually came out in the issue before of Journal of Rural Studies from a woman called Dr. Elizabeth Noy, who is with Lincoln University, who did a similar type of study, but around biodiversity with dairy farmers in New Zealand. And she came up with a concept of the good farmer. And it's not something that's written down anywhere, but it's a concept that all farmers, I think, and people within the industry understand. But what I found really interesting about that is that concept changes over time. So what was a good farmer 20 years ago might not be a good farmer 10 years ago, might not be a good farmer today. And it's probably different in different regions. And I think that, how do you build that concept of being the good farmer to include all those things I spoke about with an emissions reduction approach. And that's important because of that stuff I mentioned around international markets.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like listening to you talk there, Nick, is it not so much a case or not just a case that farmers aren't talking about this enough, but maybe industry and politicians and supply chains and everyone's talking about this too much in terms of how it's being framed, at least. Not that it's not an important topic, but it almost sounds like we're talking two different languages between what's being discussed at the farm and what's being discussed beyond the farm gate. And maybe there's just a little bit of a disconnect in the way this whole topic and area is being discussed.
Yeah, that's not where the research went to, but yeah, I think you're probably right there, Blake. One of the things I noticed in doing this work, and when you get back to the unrealistic societal expectations, which I think is a real thing and exists to some degree, so farmers are starting to look at their local area. What you've got is a real keenness to be involved in things like water quality improvement. So a lot of farmers spoke about that because it's an environmental issue and those sort of things. And the real value of that is it's local and it's visible, right? So if I'm a farmer and I improve the water quality, other people in the district see that, they see planting, they see all those types of things. The real challenge here with emissions is it's invisible and it's global. And I think that's what happens is it's just not as tangible. And so what you're trying to do is communicate market demand, and you're trying to communicate shifts in regulation on the other side of the world. And it's hard to marry all of those things up. And so I think that's where the conversation needs to head. And it can be, as you can imagine, or a lot of the farmers, I think, felt that some of these conversations were a little bit threatening because when I interviewed them, they're either sitting in a green paddock or, the background is trees waving and how can I be a part of the problem? I'm in nature every day. I'm involved in this whole process. It's natural to an extent.
Yeah. So what would be your message to farmers considering, or maybe based on your research, not considering engaging in low carbon agricultural practices?
Yeah, look, I'm probably the last person to be advising farmers on what to do practically on their farms because that's not me. And look, they are the masters of their domain behind the farm gate. But I suppose my advice would be, yes, some of the stuff can be threatening or it can be scary, but to engage. And that's some of the farmers who were a bit further down the track had done that. So understand what's happening from a market and policy perspective and to understand those things. And that's not just, I think, regulation in New Zealand, but what's happening globally as well. Talk to other farmers, talk to industry bodies, ask questions, get curious about this stuff. And I think what that does is it gives you the information to continue to be the master of your destiny behind the farm gate. So I think what we're going through is quite a rapid change. There is a lot of different forces acting upon food production in general, not just dairy farming in New Zealand, and climate change and the impacts of climate change is clearly one of those things. And that will have an impact on what we do into the future. And so kind of, forearmed is forewarned. So was it the other way around? So understanding that is really critical, I think, and bring that back in. And what was really interesting in this, Blake, was my role, dispassionate interviewer, just asking a series of questions as I went through with the farmers. But a couple of them wrote back to me and said, "Look, hey, I never actually heard what your views were on this and why you're doing this work." Right? I don't particularly have views on it, but the why was really important because, as I mentioned at the start, what I was hearing from different people, and that generally, in the instances that happened, was a series of emails, and it got to the point where someone were like, "Well, why isn't someone talking about this stuff?" And this seems quite important.
And when you say why aren't they talking about this stuff, because as we said, there's lots of talk about reducing emissions. What were they referring to in that circumstance, Nick? What was the context around?
So more like what's the driver for reducing emissions globally, and so you look at one of the things I was really interested in recently, was Denmark has introduced or announced that they're going to bring in a $30 per tonne price of carbon on agricultural emissions by 2030. And that's going to rise to $70 by 2035. And that's to help them meet their Paris Agreement commitments. They've then stated they'll be pushing for European-wide pricing on agricultural emissions. And then the next question comes down to, well, actually, we don't want to be undercut by anyone else exporting to Europe. So Europe's come up with a mechanism called the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which at the moment is only there for concrete, steel, quite high intensive emissions products. And that charges a tax effectively to any product crossing the border in those areas if they haven't set a price of carbon in the country that it's coming from. Now, the EU has said that they will bring all of their imports into that approach by 2034, and actually at the end of January 2025, they're going to outline the roadmap for that. And that really shows how regulation offshore that will end up setting a price for carbon globally, because no one will want to be penalised. But I think what it will eventually lead to is many more of these types of mechanisms. And granted, this is probably getting a little bit more trade geeky than most people would be familiar with, but it creates a mechanism globally for the movement of goods that recognises a pricing of carbon on those goods. And that will impact New Zealand farmers. And so I think it's really important to be thinking about that, because if that came in, say, mid-2030s, that's not too many breeding seasons away. And we can wait for future technology, but there are things that can be being done now as well.
So is part of it doing a better job of connecting the dots around reducing emissions to the stuff that does motivate farmers, the economics, the building a more resilient system, it's being more efficient and productive, around creating an asset and business that will be resilient intergenerationally. Do you think we could do a better job around actually telling that story and connecting those dots and making it clear how it's going to potential impacts on all of those drivers?
Absolutely. And look, this is not an overnight fix. And look, when you look at where net zero is heading, it's out to 2050. And New Zealand's commitment in that space is 24 to 47% reduction in agricultural emissions by 2050. So it's incremental. And I think that's the point, is that if you're incrementally looking at it and reducing it, then that becomes important. What that does require is knowing your number. One of the things, I did this research just before, it was while Hewaka and I were still alive. Every farmer needed to know their number. They still will be knowing their number. Only one of the 15 farmers could actually tell me what that number was. Everybody else was said, well, I know where I am on the curve. That was about it. But I think that's actually where we need to start moving towards, is having those discussions around what is your number, and talking to other farmers about how they're reducing and those types of things. So I think there are things that can be done to reduce, and looking at how farmers go about doing that.
Yeah, well, look, thanks for the conversation, Nick. I mean, I think it's a really key, relevant and interesting piece of research and possibly an area that just gets overlooked too much and is a bit of a missing piece in the whole puzzle. And I think there's been some great takeaways and insights here. Do you have any final thoughts or key messages for New Zealand farmers?
I think probably a lot of what I've spoken about won't be any surprise to any farmers. But actually the reason I'm kind of pushing the bow around this and talking is I'm really keen that perspective is understood more widely, because I think that's how change comes about, when you have that alignment and understanding, and it goes both ways. And so the final thing that I kind of came to is there is so much adaptability, resilience within the New Zealand farming community, and I'm confident that we'll continue to maintain that really high position that I spoke about globally. But I think there's also a particular lot of opportunity that comes out of being really good at doing this as well. And I just really encourage people to start talking about it more, basically, and talking about what they're doing.
Great note to wrap it up on. Look, hey, thanks, Nick. Really, really enjoyed the conversation. And as I said, really appreciate the research and contribution you've made.
Thank you, Blake.